Actually developed before the 908 had ever turned a wheel in anger, Peugeot took some of the design concepts that they had promulgated in the 908 Racer concept and the mechanicals that they had been refining for the upcoming 908 HDI FAP and packaged them all up in a new range-topping concept sedan to stand companion to their return to La Sarthe. This car was set to debut at the 2006 Paris Motor Show and follow on where the earlier RC concepts had left off. Presumably, in this instance, RC stands for really comfortable, rather than its usual use at Peugeot for their sport models and concepts, because in contrast to the Audi concepts we just covered, which clearly hewed quite closely to their sporting origins, Peugeot decided to make a large luxury sedan. I will do a video just cynically reading the press release at a later date because, I find all of them quite amusing, and even though the Volvo Your Concept Car video didn't particularly do all that well, it was quite entertaining for me to do. Be that as it may, this big cushy sedan nevertheless had a competition-derived engine mounted in a competition-derived place. The same 5.5-liter twin-turbo diesel V12 with high-pressure direct injection and particulate filtering, still mounted rear amidships, but at least to me slightly weirdly transversely oriented, just behind the passenger compartment, which contributes to the somewhat unusual rear dimensions and silhouette. The powerplant was capable of 700 horsepower and a monstrous 1,200 newton meters or 885 pound-feet of torque, sending power to the rear wheels through a 6-speed sequential gearbox. Those figures would have been quite appropriate for an LMP1 of the time, and indeed they were, because that's kind of what the 908 made, and it would have made the 908 RC the world's most powerful four-door production sedan, outdoing the Mercedes-Benz S65 AMG that, for its contemporaneous W220 iteration, made 604 horsepower and 1,001 newton meters of torque from its 6-liter twin-turbo petrol-powered V12, a title that an S-Class held until 2014, when Dodge made the Hellcat with 707 horsepower, but nowhere near as many torques. Actually, having owned a non-AMG fettled, but still twin-turbo V12-equipped W220 S-Class, I can say it's a fantastic driving experience, and as absolutely unnecessary as a V12 is for normal highway cruising, a diesel V12 would have been even more delightfully unnecessary and spectacularly worthwhile nonetheless. Actually, imagine if they'd gone on to make a CL-class competitor with the same power plant, which, that would have been fabulous. Peugeot also kindly provides us with some estimated performance figures, although whether these were, back-of-the-napkin math or something they actually put some time into is a little harder to determine, but they forecasted capabilities for the 908 RC in excess of 300 kilometers an hour, or 186 miles an hour for those of us in non-metric lands, and something that is a 1,000-meter DA that could be completed in 22 seconds, whatever that is. Presumably, it's a 1-kilometer drag race. I'm going to assume that 22 seconds is good for that, presumably, because otherwise they wouldn't have put it in the press release. But, of course, I live in non-metric lands, and we do quarter-mile drag races over here, and 22 seconds for a quarter-mile drag race would be abysmal. I think my MGB could probably manage a quarter mile in 22 seconds, and it's got 90 horsepower. You'd probably expect that kind of performance from, a first-generation diesel VW Cabrio thing, rather than a 700 horsepower limousine. So, yeah, for the purposes of this exercise, we'll assume, yes, a 1-kilometer drag race. Fair play to you all. 22 seconds is lovely. The car was built around a carbon composite and aluminum honeycomb unibody and a subassembly for the engine and rear drivetrain components, while the bodywork was of an unspecified construction material, but presumably would have been primarily either aluminum or carbon fiber if it had ever gone into production. Given the general need for solidity over out-and-out weight savings in large luxury sedans, I'd be inclined to guess that it wouldn't have been entirely carbon, some components perhaps, but more aluminum and maybe even some steel. The styling was, as we've noted, a bit unusual, particularly the kinked A-pillars in the front and this faired-in rear window, which was still, I think, aesthetically necessary, as the fairing artificially extends the roofline around part of the engine cover so that the car doesn't look like a 1960s Ford Anglia that moved to France and got delusions of grandeur. For most of the angles in the promotional photos, I actually rather like the general aesthetic of the car, but the one they picked for the press packet header does look a bit like somebody accidentally melted a second layer of bodywork over another smaller car, like some sort of strange automotive toasted cheese where the cheese melted down over the sides of the bread because the bread was too small. Okay, this is getting a bit niche on the references and a bit rambly overall. Moving on. Suspension was drop-linked double wishbones, and braking came from enormous Brembo carbon ceramic disc brakes, 38 centimeters in diameter in the front and 35 in the rear, which is 15 and 14 inches or thereabouts in imperial, I think. Front calipers were 6-piston units and rears were 4 pots, again, about what one would expect for a race-derived executive sedan. I think when I pulled apart my S600 at the end of its life, the rotors were steel, but that's an S600, not an S65, so they were also naturally a bit smaller and only had 4-piston calipers, but they were still enormous units to ensure maximum stoppage in minimal distance. I will leave the discussion and review of the interior and other concept car gubbins till a separate video, as they are clearly not derived from the 908 Racer, although now that I'm recording this in retrospect from the rest of the script, I don't hew to that in others. But I will say it looked, at least in my opinion, quite pleasantly modern and comfortable in there. Generally a strong point for large French sedans, although I could see those thigh-adjacent controls becoming problematically located for operation while driving. Needless to say, I doubt this car was ever really considered for production, and again, more's the pity because I do love a big super sedan, and if these had been in production by 2008, 2009 or so, they wouldn't be that far off from being US importable. And big sedans like this always drop value faster than a biotech startup who's had their government research grants canceled. Usually topical reference there. Anyway, that's about it for the 908. Let's head back to Germany and back to the 90s to what Car Styling magazine called the most thoroughly developed and best engineered and executed show car from a European manufacturer, the Mercedes-Benz C112.